Welcome everybody to AE911Truth Webinars. I'm Richard Gage, and we are on week 4 today with the examination of the Twin Towers extreme heat. This is 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, the architecture of destruction. And we looked last couple of weeks at the World Trade Center Building 7, and then just last week, week 3, we looked at the introduction to the Twin Towers and the explosive evidence. As for me, I've been an architect for about 29 years now, and I have worked on these structures, the construction administration for this $125 million high school and these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums in the San Francisco Bay Area. Just a little bit, about me. This high school was quite a project. More recently, though, this $400 million project, I had some the responsibility for co-managing the construction documents and construction administration for this project with 6 blocks of retail and mid-rise office space, parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. So that's just a little bit about my background. Now I'm spending 100% of my time educating other architects and engineers about the 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers, because there's so much that we don't know, as we're going to be looking at. And then have caused concern to now 2,700 architects and engineers who have joined the petition at AE911Truth.org, and you can also sign that petition if you have concerns after seeing the information in these webinars. In week 3 last week, we looked at the evidence of explosions, the sudden near freefall collapse of these towers, the high velocity lateral ejections, the shattering of the steel frame completely from top to bottom, and the midair pulverization of concrete. All of this and more. You can see this webinar on the website, ae911truth.org/webinars, where you may be watching today's webinar, which is week 4, where we will be looking into the extreme heat produced pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, and nanothermite. What does all this mean? This is one of our most fascinating webinars, and I want to get into it, but let's just first all get on the same page, find out what happened that day in the morning, and how this official story was developed.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth: the impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, there's the official story right there in a nutshell, provided by Gene Corley, engineer. Let's examine that story and see how it holds up to the evidence, because in the West, we've had for 100 years the scientific method. We have a question. How did the towers come down? Well, we do some background research. How have other towers come down? We make observations. We construct a hypothesis. It's our best guess. I think they came down by fire. Maybe they came down by the damage from the planes. Maybe they came down by controlled demolition. All of the hypotheses are laid out so that we can review them objectively and the evidence for each. We make predictions based on these hypotheses. We test them with experiments. We analyze the results and draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open and transparent manner. If the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back. We construct a new hypothesis that stands a better chance against the evidence, the experiments, the conclusions, the background research, the observations. So we're going to use the scientific method today. We're going to gather data. How do we do that? Well, let's look, for instance, first at controlled demolition, which we saw in weeks 1 and 2 has some typical features associated with it. So if this was a controlled demolition, we'd expect it to have some of the same features. What are they? Well, a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint, because demolition waves remove those column supports, allowing it to fall straight down. And at free fall, acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the 100,000 tons or so of structural steel designed to keep the Twin Towers up. Number 5, resulting in the total dismemberment almost of the steel structure, so it's broken up, ready for loading and shipment. Minimal damage to adjacent structures. Sounds of explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. Number 8, enormous clouds of pulverized concrete. And number 9, explosive charges visible at the upper floors. These are often called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. And of course, number 10, chemical evidence left behind in the debris, residue of cutter charges. Now, this is all direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire can't create any one of these, let alone all of them. So these features represent a great test to determine if something is a controlled demolition or fire. So that's the direction we're heading in. Of course, if you have additional circumstantial or corroborative evidence, such as government documentation, experts agreeing, at least those experts who are objective, who are unbiased, who may not be reliant, for instance, upon the federal government for $100,000 annual contracts to keep them in business. But those who are, say, which is, by the way, most of the controlled demolition industry, rely on those federal contracts, but say outside sources, outside the country. Foreknowledge of the destruction, video documentation. Regarding foreknowledge, it takes months to plan and set up, and dozens of workers to place and plant and engineer explosives. So often there's foreknowledge. This is all proof of controlled demolition, as we saw in weeks 1 and 2. With respect to the Twin Towers now, comparing its features to the features of controlled demolition, we looked last week in week 3 at the first 8 or so of these features, finding that there were many features regarding the explosive evidence that match up. Today we're going to be focusing on actually number 8, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete. And we'll be looking at a few other features as well. With respect to this one, the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for investigation of fire and explosions actually says, look in your investigations for thermal effects, extreme heat. That's what we're looking at today. The large volumes of gas and large amount of heat released in chemical explosions cause rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. And of course, we've noted, or will be noting, that these do occur before, during, and directly after the final destruction of the World Trade Center towers. As you can see already here, these plumes of cauliflower-shaped gases, smoke clouds, unfolding rapidly as the Twin Towers have their sudden onset of destruction from the very explosive event that we looked at last week. So this is much, much more heat expanding these clouds than was available in the fires, particularly in the South Tower, which was observed to be going out at the onset of the collapse of those buildings, or the destruction of that building. Where is all of this heat generated from? We'll be looking at that today. So completely covering lower Manhattan, of course, from river to river. Extremely rapidly expanding cauliflower-like plume are not caused by the fires or the gravitational collapse. They could only have been caused by intense heat from expanding explosives, which we saw the evidence for last week. Well, let's look where that heat might be coming from as we examine feature number 9, extreme heat and its evidence found in the debris pile, again, before, during, and after the final destruction. Here before, by Bechtel, citing and documenting 2,800 Fahrenheit temperatures. Now, this is much, much hotter, 3-4 times hotter than the temperature of the fires that were in those buildings. The jet fuel, of course, burned up 90% of it in the first 10 minutes, according to NIST. The rest of it was gone. Excuse me, 90% burned up outside the building in the initial impact. The rest of it was gone in 10 minutes, the jet fuel. So, and jet fuel is just it's a hydrocarbon. It doesn't burn any hotter than desks or chairs and so forth inside the building. So where is this heat coming from? In fact, Richard Garlock, who works with Leslie Robertson, the structural engineer of the World Trade Center himself, says the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. Where does that kind of heat come from that can melt steel? And there's plenty of people that are talking about all of this molten metal. Saw pools of literally molten steel, says Peter Tully, president of the Tully Construction Cleanup. It was dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter, this beam. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams. Well, this material is observed pouring out of the South Tower 8 minutes prior to its collapse. This molten iron or steel, we know by the color of it. It's not aluminum, as NIST was forced to speculate upon repeated questioning, but molten aluminum or melted airplane just looks like molten aluminum. It's silvery in daylight conditions. It's not that bright yellow, white hot, or even orange color. So it can't be what NIST has suggested. Ranging from the molten metal, which was still red hot weeks after the event, molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains, molten steel beams, streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down, metal dripping from a beam, dripping molten steel. This is what they're talking about. It's documented in photographs, this glowing metal, liquid metal falling out of the material held in the excavator here. Steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures, says the author of the FEMA report, Dr. Jonathan Barnett. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. You see the discontinuity here. Normal office fires are maybe 500, 600, maybe 1,000 degrees. NIST actually claims, without any evidence, 1,800 degree fires. That's still less than half required to partially evaporate beams, as you see here, and documented by Abulhassan Astani, also one of the structural engineers who had the National Science Foundation grant to review this steel with unlimited access to the Freshkills landfill. I saw melting of girders, and there indeed it is. In fact, FEMA, in their May 2002 report, the Building Performance Assessment Team report, in their Appendix C, does a complete metallurgical examination of the two pieces of steel that were saved. Remember from last week that 98% of the steel was shipped away starting 2 weeks after 9/11 to China for recycling before forensic investigators could get their hands on it. But here is documented on the remaining steel, or some of it, that they did analyze very carefully. We have some, not just melted steel, but never before seen in building fires, eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, turning solid steel girder into Swiss cheese. Never before observed. But here it is, gaping holes, some larger than a silver dollar in this piece of steel. This one actually from World Trade Center Building 7, and the other one from the Twin Towers. Rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting. Where does this sulfidation come from? It's a liquid eutectic mixture with iron. What is liquid iron? It's molten iron, again, 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Sulfur, attack on the steel. Where does this sulfur come from? They have no clear explanation for its identification, but it's the metal workers, the iron workers, the demolition workers, they smelled it. Everybody smelled this sulfur down there. The presence of sulfur is documented in the metallurgical examination here. So NIST claims that, oh, the sulfur must have come from the gypsum board because gypsum board has calcium sulfate in it, but that's not sulfur. Calcium sulfate can't turn into sulfur, and gypsum board has never turned around and attacked the steel, which it has been designed to protect for almost 100 years. No, that's never happened. That's not a decent explanation. There is no explanation either for the liquid or melted concrete. That takes 3,200 degrees, more than 3 times what these fires could have been, or 4 times. Fire temperature is so intense that concrete melted the lava around everything in its path, including this gun or handgun from the police department in Building 6. Let's listen.
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat.
And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
Wow. Well, it's not melted airplane because aluminum doesn't rust. These huge chunks of molten steel and molten concrete, corroborated by the NASA airplane overflights with their infrared cameras documenting at World Trade Center 7, 1,340 degrees, and the Twin Towers 1,160 and 1,377 degrees. These temperatures are also hotter than the fires, and this is temperature measured at the surface of the pile days after the event, 5 days after the event. But there's no fire on the surface of any of these three high-rise collapses. The fires are burning well underneath. So what's being measured here is the temperature of something much, much hotter down deep in the pile and in the basements. And this is denied by John Gross, co-project leader or lead engineer of the NIST report. Let's listen.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who produced it.
Get down below and you'll see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry. Like lava.
Volcano actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug up.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of the wall.
The cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. The steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
That was Leslie Robertson, the structural engineer of the World Trade Center Twin Towers, documenting himself a river of steel. And yet John Gross denies this, but here he is on the pile, cutting off the very piece of steel used for the metallurgical examination by FEMA, which then NIST rejected that metallurgical examination and did not include it in their final report when they took over, because they had taken over the FEMA report or the FEMA investigation earlier. But here it is. In fact, John Gross's shadow is all over this evidence. So what does all this mean? Well, fires are only 600, maybe 1,200 degrees, according to Thomas Iger here. Fahrenheit. NIST claims, again, 1,800. What can create the temperatures we've just been looking at? Structural steel melts 2,800 degrees or so. We'll be looking at thermite, a possible source for this temperature, which provides temperatures up to 4,500 degrees. Remember, hydrocarbons only burn maybe 600, 1,400 degrees in open air, including jet fuel. Yet steel and iron had completely, definitely melted. So what can cause this incredible temperatures? Well, let's look at it, see if there's any evidence of thermite in possible cutter charges as we look for this chemical evidence with feature number 10. Could thermite have produced all that molten metal? Well, what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermite, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere. We have a possible source in thermite of the extreme temperatures that are documented but unexplained. We have a possible source for the molten iron, and we have a possible source and explanation for the sulfur, which was unexplained. But let's see if there's evidence of thermite. Well, NFPA 921 Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation says that you should look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite. NIST acknowledges that it never looked for such evidence. After claiming that they didn't find it, they acknowledge it in writing a year later that they never looked for it. But others have. In fact, independent scientists like Stephen Jones has a nuclear physicist. He says, well, thermite would have a signature. So let's look for common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, but also unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. Altogether, these elements in the periodic table. Well, somebody sent him a chunk from this 40-pound piece of previously molten iron, and Stephen Jones does an analysis on it. What does he find? Well, it's predominantly iron. So he can rule out aluminum from the jet planes or lead from batteries. It's got abundant manganese, so he can rule out structural steel as a major component. Something else is going on here. It also has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, potassium, manganese, and fluorine in abundance. Wow. Manganese is from the potassium permanganate. It's commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in sol gel type thermite charges, very special thermite charges. So this is part of a thermite fingerprint that's found in this piece of steel from the World Trade Center sculpture. A second sample from this 9/11 monument finds that through X-ray fluorescence, iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese. Wow. Well, look at this piece of steel from the memorial in Manitoba. This is not an oxyacetylene torch cut. This is something very, very intense, fast, heavy, less accurate. This is what oxyacetylene torches look like. They're very clean, efficient, designed to help the workers cut straight through, not zigzagging around columns like this one. So something else is going on here. So what do we find also? Aluminum, evidence of aluminum, impartially burned thermite, the fingerprint. Aluminum oxide is usually the gas associated, but if it doesn't get completely reacted chemically, you could have aluminum. So that piece of slag from that beam, indeed, what does it show? Oxygen, iron, silica, aluminum, manganese, key ingredients of thermite. Well, how would this be used? Well, John Cole, civil engineer, in his backyard, created his own cutter charges using thermite and thermate. Take a look. So he was able to cut almost completely cleanly through this connection, and you can see this 20-minute video. It's an extraordinary search on YouTube for John Cole. The Great Thermate Debate is what it's called. And there are much more sophisticated devices that were indeed patented prior to 9/11, which issue molten iron through the cutter charge and cutting through in milliseconds. Very, very thick structural steel sections. So this needs to be looked at. In fact, these devices can be made with consolidated thermate or thermite, where the casing itself is completely spent and used up, where there's nothing left but molten iron after it is self-consumed. So that's important because maybe there's no evidence left behind, such as cutter charge casings, which are normally left behind when high energy explosives are used in normal controlled demolitions. And why wouldn't they use high energy explosives in the Twin Towers? Well, maybe because they didn't want the extreme audio signature of a blast, or thousands of them going off like you have in controlled demolitions. Maybe they didn't want the bright flashes associated with high energy explosives like C4 and RDX. But of course, you'd have all of this other evidence left behind if you used thermite, such as sol gels, which would leave a residue, 1,3-diphenylpropane. Well, interestingly enough, the EPA finds a molecule that was present at levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenylpropane. We've never observed it in any other sampling that we've done, says Eric Schwartz of the EPA. Remains unexplained. Just like what was found in this fine powder, so ubiquitous on 9/11. What does the R.J. Lee group doing toxicological studies on the dust find? The U.S. Geological Survey doing their toxicological studies. Molten iron spheres, previously molten iron. We know they're molten because that's how they get spherical. When thermite is set off, it releases molten iron. So in an aerosolized liquid, it forms itself into a sphere. Like these, found by the USGS, documented in all the samples. In fact, up to 6% of the dust samples collected are these unexplained, previously molten iron microspheres. They're so common that they call it a signature component. This isn't like background dust. This is not. This is way more prevalent and distinct. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these unexplained, previously molten iron microspheres. Fascinating. And confirmed, of course, also by independent researcher Stephen Jones. In fact, here's an experiment he did setting off thermite. Let's take a look. And slowing this down, you see already in this small sample, thousands of falling, cooling molten iron spheres. And of course, they would fall and cool. They would fall everywhere out there, including on the tops of these cars, which could explain the toasting of the tops of these cars parked further away from the Twin Towers. How else can they be explained? Well, what else was found in the World Trade Center dust? A 4-inch thick blanket of pulverized concrete we talked about last week in week 3's webinar. What is found in this blanket of concrete across this 3-square-mile area? Well, 4 independently collected and tested and documented samples from this international team of scientists led by Stephen Jones and Niels Harrit. They find the same curious red-gray chips in all of the samples. They're red on one side, gray on the other, about 1/16 of an inch long, the largest ones. Looks like paint, but it's not paint, because they go in and look at the red layer and they find what? Carbon, oxygen, aluminum, silicon, the ingredients of thermite, iron, elemental iron, not steel, elemental iron. Well, they get real curious and they look in 50,000 times with an electron microscope, and they document here the iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelet that are the ingredients of thermite, iron oxide, which is basically rust, and aluminum powder. But these are smaller than the diameter, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. This is nanoparticles. This is not made by grinding these materials down, which is how they make thermite, normal thermite. This is a very highly engineered nanothermite. It's an energetic material. In a heater, it ignites at 420 degrees centigrade, maybe 800 degrees Fahrenheit, and produces temperatures capable of melting steel. Now, paint doesn't do that. This is not paint. And this is comparable to the published data by Lawrence Livermore Lab, Los Alamos Lab. In fact, when these chips are ignited in the differential scanning calorimeter, they produce the very same molten iron spheres that were produced and that were documented by R.J. Lee and the USGS in the World Trade Center dust. So we know where those spheres came from. There's no question. As if we didn't know, because they're found attached to partially ignited chips from the World Trade Center dust, as you can see here. So you see, this is a completely internally consistent, self-corroborating set of data that is absolutely critical for any thorough, complete, accurate, truthful understanding of what happened at the World Trade Center. And yet it's completely ignored by NIST. It's called super thermite, developed by Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. You see, when they get these particles so small, the chemical reaction is instantaneous because the volume, the surface volume, is enormous. And so you've engineered an incendiary to become more explosive. And this is used in the military. Now it's a very high-tech process made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. So, yes, we need an investigation. Yes, there are companies that make this stuff that need to be investigated. No, AE911Truth is not responsible for those investigations. Those are criminal investigations that need to be performed by the FBI, the people who should be looking at the source for this material, because it's all very well documented and peer-reviewed in a 25-page paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. You can read the whole thing. It's very clear. So we've looked at last week and this week 10 characteristic features and uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition with the very explosive evidence that we looked at last week, with the incendiary evidence that we looked at this week. Some of these are not typical features, but they are certainly in alignment with the conclusion that the towers suffered an explosive demolition. Fire can't create any one of these features, let alone all of them. So if we have, so we're beginning to distinguish between fire and explosive demolition, and this is very helpful also if we have direct evidence of or indirect evidence, corroborative, circumstantial evidence from FEMA and the NIST reports. FEMA, by the way, citing Bill Manning, the editor of Fire Engineering, citing that the FEMA investigation is a half-baked farce. Wow, why would he say that? It was the structural damage from the planes and the explosive ignition of jet fuel in themselves were not enough to bring down the towers. Well, what does the NIST report say? Because $20 million were spent in a 3-year effort that produced 10,000 pages. And they were tasked by Congress to determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed, and how and why World Trade Center 7 collapsed. Did they do that? No. It's amazing. Look at this. Their objective, they say, was to the initiation of collapse. For brevity in this report, this sequence is referred to as a probable collapse sequence. It doesn't actually include, though, the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached, and they claim collapse became inevitable. Well, there's nothing inevitable about the complete total destruction of a high-rise building due to a local failure. In fact, this is a mountain of distraction, 10,000 pages, a ubiquitous, irrelevant detail, none of which, other than this one half of a page, looks at the events following the initiation of collapse, where the first floor truss sagged and began to pull in the columns, as we looked at last week. They say in this half page, the structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that. It came down essentially in free fall. So they're just waving their hands magically without taking the time to calculate the capacity of the cold, hard, intact steel below the point of jet plane impacts to resist this falling mass up above it. No analysis whatsoever. It's complete speculation. In fact, it should be called the final report on the initiation of collapse. So they did not fulfill their charter given to them by the Congress. In fact, they acknowledge this. We were unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers upon hearing our request for correction or seeing it in 2007. Well, what do the experts say? Well, here's one of the 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE911Truth calling for a new investigation. Why? He says, it doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why complete collapse of the Twin Towers became inevitable? I don't know. Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds? He says. Some say 15 seconds. NIST actually says 10 seconds. Pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel. Let's not sweep it under the rug. William Rice, structural engineer, says the prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free-fall acceleration, as if the 100,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework didn't even exist. David Scott, structural engineer, Scotland. Near free-fall collapse violates laws of physics. You can remember that one. Scott Granger, fire protection engineer. All three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. Edward Muniak, fire protection engineer. You say the collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire. No high-rise fire, as we saw in the last couple of weeks, has ever brought down a skyscraper. Even one of the authors of the FEMA report, who had written this book, Why Buildings Fall Down, what does he say?
You've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
Well, this is an opinion that didn't follow through into the FEMA report when he helped write it, nor did this original opinion from Ronald Hamburger, who also said, it appeared to me the charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised. Well, how did he learn that no bombs had been detonated? He was told that, and he dropped his original assessment. Well, with the evidence we've shown today, we at AE911Truth, the 2,700 architects and engineers, believe that the hypothesis is corroborated. We believe we have the 10 key characteristic features and uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition that is evidence of direct explosive destruction. Fire can't create any one of these, let alone all of them. With the additional circumstantial and corroborative evidence, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you are concerned, we ask you to join us in signing the petition at AE911Truth.org. Become a member of AE911Truth, support us so that we can go to the conventions, like the dozen conventions of the American Institute of Architects that we have been attending, educating architects, submitting a resolution calling upon the AIA to call for a new investigation of World Trade Center 7 in particular. We'll be on that at the National Convention yet again in Orlando in April of 2017. So we need your support. You can donate for these projects. You can become a member, a monthly sustaining member, and you can volunteer. We have many, many projects for you. In fact, I want to introduce you to Andy Steele, our operations coordinator. Andy has been with us on all these webinars, and I forgot to introduce Andy earlier on the program, and I want you to meet him now because he's essential, and he's going to be helping us out, especially with the volunteers. Andy, how can they help?
Well, in all the ways that Richard has just outlined, we are reaching out to so many different organizations, but it requires a lot of work, a lot of things that got to get done that we don't talk about in the general public because it's just regular work. So if you want to help out, roll up your sleeves, do more than talk about it on the internet, then we need you. Go up to AE911Truth.org and click the What You Can Do tab at the very top, and you fill out a quick application, and we will get in touch with you and see if we can get you on a work task or project that will really go a long way towards reaching out to lots of professionals. So please do that and get involved, and it's very satisfying to be involved. Back to you, Richard.
Indeed it is, and thanks so much, Andy. We'll be hearing more from Andy as we take your questions. So think about, what you've heard today. Formulate a question, submit it online at ae911truth.org/webinars, and you can do lots from home on your computer. Write your elected representatives, television, radio, newspapers. The more pressure that these people, agencies, and get, the more responsive they will be forced to be. Tell everyone you know. Don't withhold this information from your colleagues, your friends, your family. They deserve to know the truth about what happened at the World Trade Center. After all, the World Trade Center towers and what happened on 9/11 spawned two major wars in which 2 million people have been killed, 7,000 U.S. soldiers. We have legislated away our civil liberties in the form of executive orders and legislation such as the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, an executive order that allows any of us to be now arrested without charge, without a right to a lawyer, a trial, a jury. This is not what our forefathers fought for. So, and it all goes back to 9/11, including the $4.5 trillion global war on terror. If there's any question about what happened on 9/11, i.e. these 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers, then we must get to the bottom of it. And you can do that by getting the word out, screening these DVDs, speak to new audiences, share the AE911 Truth resources that we have, such as the 50-page booklet, Beyond Misinformation, which pulls the rug out from the NIST report, analyzing it piece by piece, showing how none of it is true, actually, except for some of the very basic facts. But they've ignored most all the evidence that we have shown you in this webinar, 4-week webinar series. So get this to people. In fact, you can get it for free right now. We'll email you the PDF. Just click on Beyond Misinformation below on our website if you're watching. Also, you can go to the website and sign up for the newsletter, and you'll get the Beyond Misinformation PDF. You can share it. We have gone through 70 American cities last year with our latest DVD, Firefighters, Architects, Engineers Expose 9/11 Myths, with Eric Lawyer, who founded Firefighters for 9/11 Truth and Unity. And he goes through the NFPA manual, National Fire Protection Association, and talks about how NIST flagrantly violated the most basic tenets and guidelines there. And so we present together in this DVD, which you can get online. Just search Firefighters, Architects, Engineers Expose 9/11 Myths. Comes right up, as does Experts Speak Out. Let's take a look and see this 2-minute trailer for this extraordinary, evidence-packed, landmark DVD that we made.
We don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. You know, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how these buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
We have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined, scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
So this is a DVD that you can share with everyone. It's online. You can send the link to everyone. The 60-minute version is online for free. The 90-minute version is even better. It's in our store. Click "What Can You Do" up at the top of our website. It contains 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence that much of which we saw in today's webinar: iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite, pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron. And next week we'll be back to World Trade Center Building 7 as we start yet again in November with our 4-week seminar series. We'll be combining weeks 1 and 2 next week, so we'll collect Building 7 all into one webinar. So we invite you to join us and come back, but I'm sure at this point we have some questions, don't we, Andy?
Yes, we do. We got 2 questions this week. First one asks us if the leadership in NIST changed and they decided to do a test of the dust for what you found, do you know if they're in possession of samples still in order to do it, or has too much time passed?
Well, there are still samples that are being found. Well, first of all, there's about 90,000 tons of the dust that is buried under 6 feet of concrete at the Fresh Kills landfill. There's plenty of dust if there's the will to properly analyze it, but there's also up to a dozen samples that have been given to and analyzed, much of which has been analyzed by various teams of scientists. It's around. I have some myself. It's fascinating. You can put a magnet up to this dust and you can see the iron microspheres come right up to it. It's not, magic. They respond to their iron to magnetism. And others have found the red-gray chips and have tested them, corroborating the work of the small team of scientists. I would love to see the leadership in NIST change and be open to actually looking for, not just claiming that they found no evidence of explosive demolition, but actually looking for it, because they admit they didn't, right? So I don't know what samples they do or don't have. They've certainly inadvertently perhaps documented temperatures in the steel that show melting. So people say, well, the structural steel system didn't have to melt. All it had to do was soften 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, which it can weaken at that temperature. And we're saying, okay, maybe the temperatures were 1200. Maybe the steel did weaken. That does not explain the overwhelming, multitudinous testimonials of melted steel, which we've seen and we see on the screen right now. So we're just not buying it. We do need a complete change of leadership at NIST. Not too much time has passed. No, we have the samples. We have the steel that we showed you that has been tested by independent scientists as well.
All right, our second and final question today asks, have any of the authors of the other reports that documented the microspheres commented on Dr. Harrett's work?
I'm thinking that the questioner is referring to some of the scientists who have analyzed the dust but have not come out and actually corroborated any of the scientists who are calling for a new investigation. I'm talking about R.J. Lee, the U.S. Geological Survey, which did detailed analysis of the dust, finding these microspheres, the diameter of a human hair on average, naked to the human eye, that are ubiquitous and yet unexplained. So no, I'm not aware that any of them have come out and said, "Hey, this is evidence that corroborates Dr. Harrett's work." I don't think they've commented on Dr. Harrett's work at all, not to my knowledge. Andy, are you aware of of anything else that would shed light on this question?
I'm not aware of anything either. And so right now, as it stands, the only people who have decided to come out and say the obvious here are the people involved with Dr. Harrod's report, which you can find in various places all over the internet and has been peer reviewed. Unfortunately, with the government investigations, with a large part of 9/11, it seems that much of the investigations went into a direction that were pre-designed to come to a certain conclusion. In the case of what we cover at AE911Truth, obviously the controlled demolition hypothesis, or not the controlled demolition hypothesis, excuse me, the collapse hypothesis was what they were looking to achieve, and a lot of what their actions went in that direction. So certain things were ignored, like what we see with them refusing to test the dust samples for explosives. And there's been a lot of pressure for people not to opine on this and not to look down these kind of dark corners that Dr. Harrod's team and AE911Truth has had the courage to do. So we do encourage them to speak out, and we hope that they do.
Absolutely. Yes, those are the questions we had today. If you have more, feel free to submit them. We looked today in week 4 at the evidence of extreme heat in the Twin Towers. Next week, as I mentioned, we'll be looking at World Trade Center Building 7, the 3rd skyscraper that collapsed on 9/11, the one that most architects and engineers are completely unaware of. Why? It should have been the most studied building failure in history, the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history, and yet relatively unknown. We'll be looking at it in depth as well as the overview next week. So come back and join us. We'll be here, and thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today. And we will catch up with you next Thursday, 1 p.m. Pacific. Bye, everyone.